Welcome to the Islam Unraveled podcast. We greet you with the traditional Muslim greeting of peace and blessings, Assalamu alaikum. On this podcast, we seek to help unravel the narrative surrounding Islam and Muslims in the West, as well as build bridges of understanding and friendship between cultures and communities. We acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the traditional unceded territory of the First Nation peoples of BC. On this podcast, we encourage open discussion, and therefore the views expressed by our guests do not necessarily represent the views of Islam Unraveled. To support the work we're doing, please send your donations to finances@ihsan.ca. That's finances@ihsan.ca.
Well, thank you so much, Councillor. And this is Councillor Christine Boyle of the City Council of Vancouver, the most beautiful city and the greatest city in Canada and the world, in my opinion. So thank you for joining us. And I wanted to, as we talked earlier before we started the interview, that last I saw you was at the Vancouver Al Jamia Mosque last year when you brought the proclamation from the city of Vancouver to commemorate January 29th as a day of a memorial for the attacks at the Quebec City Mosque. So we want to thank you again on behalf of the City Council for that proclamation from the Mayor and the Council. So thank you again. And please, if you wouldn't mind just talking about it, how all of that came together.
Sure, I'm happy to, and it was an honor to get to be the deputy mayor and read and present that proclamation and be part of a really incredibly moving recognition in your community, and to see the diverse mix of faces who showed up. And I'm always very happy to get to be inside the Al Jamia Mosque and be part of the prayers and community that happen there. So I'm sure you could say more. The proclamation came about through a motion to City Council, and that motion was in line with calls across the country to formally recognize this date as a date of remembrance and recognition of Islamophobia, and specific to one terrible incident, of course, but also I think in recognition of the presence of Islamophobia in day-to-day lives in cities and communities across the country, that we can and should continue to name and address in a whole myriad of ways. And that's certainly a commitment for me, a commitment for council, for a lot of folks across the city. And so it was an honor to get to present that proclamation, and also to get to do this work in an ongoing way with you and your listeners and followers and others across the city.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for that. And you know, based on the relationship we've had with the City Council, the City of Vancouver, and the Mayor, and previous administrations, there's been a lot of support for just inclusivity and fostering a sense of a community and equality and inclusivity, which personally speaking for myself, I felt great support, and the Al Jamia Mosque and the Muslim community of Vancouver has always felt great support from the city. So maybe just for our listeners to introduce yourself and your background, for those that may not be aware of your background and how you came to public office and joined Kendi Stewart and the rest of your team to you know, and I actually met the mayor the day before the election. He came and spoke to our congregation at the Al Jamia Mosque, and the next day he was the mayor. So yeah, so interesting to make all those connections. But please introduce yourselves for the listeners that may not be aware of your background and the City Council and your vision and the city's mission for the greater Vancouver community.
Sure, happy to. So this is my first term as a city councillor and in an elected office role. I come out of community organizing and community work. I spent many years working in East Vancouver as a youth worker, and in the downtown east side doing outreach work there, and then doing some climate work on climate justice nationally, and actually my climate work was multi-faith. So I sort of joke, my career path has been very winding, much as I think my parents would have liked for me to become a doctor. I have had many jobs, and I've learned a ton through all of it, and I'm really grateful to have had that path that's brought me to where I am. So I was engaged in community work across the city, and particularly with some of our neighbors in the city who are struggling most. And that work actually led me to theological school. I studied down in the United States, down at the University of Berkeley, did a master's degree in religious leadership for social change. And I was very lucky down in California to get to study with a multi-faith group of students who were studying to be ministers and rabbis and imams and Buddhist leaders all together. And then I came back to Vancouver. I was ordained into the United Church of Canada as a minister, and I was working part-time at the Canadian Memorial United Church in Vancouver, and also doing national multi-faith climate work, helping faith communities look at their existing buildings and figure out how to make them greener and more energy efficient in buildings across the country. And at the same time was involved in local issues, continued to be involved in the kind of justice and housing and inequality issues that I have been involved in for years in Vancouver. And that led me to being asked by a number of people to run for council with a municipal party I've been involved in called One City Vancouver. And so I ran for office, One City elected myself and Jennifer Reddy to the school board. And this council, as folks may or may not know, doesn't have a majority from any one party. So I've been working with my colleagues from other parties and with the mayor, who is an independent, on all sorts of important issues. And I think for the most part, we as a council, as you said, really share a commitment to addressing racism and creating a more welcoming community for everyone. And sometimes the way we think that should be done looks a bit different, or the level of urgency we feel on it, but it is a shared commitment across the council, and we've been able to move the needle in a number of ways because of that commitment.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100% about the city's commitment to inclusivity. I've seen it time and time again. Now, we talked about racism, and obviously we have a multi-racial, multi-religious community, and First Nations, the Black community, the Muslim community, and many others. And just as you've done a lot of work with other faith-based groups, as well as I have. And what was interesting, at least in the work that I had done in a faith-based way with other communities, was we found that every group felt that they were the ones that were, I would say, discriminated against. So everyone felt that the prejudice was directed mainly towards them per se, and I would meet a lot of the groups, and I'd be like, you guys seem pretty mainstream to me, but it seems like there's a psychology, a human psychology, where maybe the other. And so part of even especially during the pandemic, we're not able to meet in person as communities to break bread, and really when people from other races and religions get together and meet and get to know one another, because we live in such a multicultural, multiracial city. There's a level of brotherhood and sisterhood, understanding, and community belonging. But because of the internet and kind of algorithms that kind of silo people to certain belief sets, so people's racial or religious identities are maybe reinforced, and their beliefs about other groups are being reinforced by certain information that may not be accurate. And so dealing with that, and as a city, I'm sure there are challenges on a daily basis, but specifically about racism and cultural, like one incident because of the coronavirus, and part of the learnings we've had with RCMP hate crimes is that usually global events inform what happens to on a day-to-day basis to people. And with the coronavirus, Chinese and Asian Canadians were there was a big spike in verbal abuse, physical abuse, because for whatever reason people would blame. I think it was 800%. The VPD said 800% increase in race incidents, bias, and attacks on people that have Asian or Chinese background. So dealing with that, how did the city respond? I'm sure the city's had so many challenges. This is like a historic year, so I'm sure our listeners would love to hear how the city came at these challenges.
Yeah, it's a great question, and as you outlined, the increase in racially motivated hate incidents in Vancouver since the coronavirus hit has been incredibly alarming. I also think you outline well how that connects to global events. You know, there's often some debate about whether or not the level of racism and white supremacy down in the United States impacts us up here. And I would say it certainly does in a myriad of ways. And so those numbers are alarming. And I think the flip side is that the huge public conversation that people have been having around racism, in particular around anti-Black racism and the movement for Black lives. Those are important learnings and really ground shifting conversations that have been happening here in Vancouver, tied to conversations and movements elsewhere as well. And the city is part of that learning. So the city, prior to this year, prior to the pandemic, had been working on a strategy to address anti-Black racism, as well as a strategy focused on Indigenous health and wellness, both of which have come out of a lot of community advocacy from residents and organizations across the city, naming that we as the city need to do better on that work. And we have had for a number of years some very specific work in Chinatown, looking at the transformation of Chinatown and the preservation of the cultural heritage that exists across that neighborhood. So ongoing projects that preceded COVID, and then the pandemic sort of stalled out a lot of that work because we were focused so intensely on managing the impacts of the pandemic, and particularly managing the impacts of the pandemic on our most vulnerable neighbors and residents. And in our city budget conversation that this last fall in December, council and the city really recommitted to doing that anti-racism work that we had underway already that got delayed a bit. So the anti-Black racism work is back on the table, and we're back into it, as well as looking at a broader anti-racism strategy that weaves together each of these specific pieces. You know, as I'm sure you know and your listeners know, there's a value both in the broad work of addressing racism and hate, and also the specifics of looking at what does anti-Black racism look like? How does that impact our neighbors who are Black in the city, and how do we specifically address that incarnation of racism and hate, and similar with anti-Asian racism. So we're trying to do both of those things, the high level pieces and the on the ground pieces. And I just want to lift up, as you mentioned too, I think the work that communities are doing in building those bridges among themselves is really important. So I too have spent years doing interfaith and multi-faith work in Vancouver and more broadly, and I see how important those bridges are to be built, the relationships and the breaking down of barriers so that folks see one another. There a reminder I often find helpful is that it is hard to hate people up close, and so we should not in a time of social distancing, but otherwise we should invite one another in up close and hear those stories and see one another better, and that is the best antidote to the kind of hate and despair that we see in other parts of the world and that we know exist here too. So I've been delighted to have been able to do that multi-faith work. I will say I miss it. In fact, it's how years ago, Haroon Khan and I were both on the board of the Interspiritual Center, and so that was my first interaction with the Al Jamia Mosque, was in those relationships, and they have continued over the years, and it's been great to see all of the work around homelessness, around providing food that the community has done. So amplifying those stories, bringing people together, I think that's the community piece of the work. And then we as the city are doing some systemic work at the city level, and the province is certainly engaged as well. And everybody doing their part, I think, is what this urgent moment requires.
Agreed. And as you know, with Haroon and Al Jamia Mosque and the rest of our team, Al Jamia Masjid Vancouver has been at the forefront to really reach out and with Islam Unraveled, which is the outreach to other communities. I will say, after what happened in Quebec City, the outpouring of people from Vancouver that came to the mosque of their own, like they came with candles, with flowers, with cards, tears in their eyes. I was moved. I was emotionally moved. Really, it was a life-changing experience for me that I really, really, how people care just about their fellow human beings, regardless of race or religion, was an impactful event, specifically on me. I can't speak for anybody else, but I was very moved. And then at the Jack Pool Plaza, there's a larger memorial where thousands of people, and it was a blizzard. There was like snow. It was cold. Yet people came just for a couple, 3 hours, really making their time to come out. And I thought, what a great city! What an amazing set of values and it was across every race and religion. So we had rabbis come, we had ministers come, we had congregation, we had non-religious people come, and it was amazing. And what it kind of brought to mind was our Vancouver values and the city of Vancouver, like moving forward, like issues about homelessness and addiction. And part of what we as a Muslim community all came together to establish the Muslim Care Center. And it was many team members from many mosques, many Islamic organizations, to do public work that's identifiable, that Muslims are actually out in vulnerable communities like the downtown east side, and our locations on Main and Hastings. And 7 days a week throughout the pandemic, we've been giving food. Recently, we did blankets and socks and various other needful items for folks that are sleeping in parks and what have you. So we've done that with other Muslim organizations. And so part of the thought process with all the Muslim organizations coming together, that we are shoulder to shoulder with our brothers and sisters of other faiths and other races, and the problems that you've seen personally in your previous work and your current work on the downtown east side. It takes a village, it takes a city, it takes everybody to work together to help one another. And so what we did find was, we found even a couple hundred Muslims that were on the downtown east side that had mental health problems, drug addiction problems, amongst other people that had these issues. And so an expression of, I would say, what happened from Quebec City eventually evolved into this community work in a broader way. Haroon, he was the one that initially did, it was called Ramadan Spirit. So at the end of Ramadan, Haroon would host from the Al Jamia Mosque and bring a lot of folks together to give a lot of different meal items at the end of Ramadan. And so a continuation of the care center was to do that every day. And so because the problem is not just one day, it's like 7 days a week, and food is one part. So I realize with the city council, with the mayor, the homeless crisis, addiction problems in our communities are significant. And so strategies that the city has, the council, I'm sure you've had many discussions regarding that. What are the current strategies and plans to help address this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I just want to say it's such an incredible story, I think, of the way that you have turned grief from the Quebec City massacre into this gift to others in the community is so powerful. And I have known it, but hearing you say it again is really moving, and I think a valuable story to amplify more broadly for folks, you know, in the spirit of better understanding each other. I think that grief into a gift is so powerful for us all. So absolutely, the city is and council is talking about and wrestling with the challenges that our city and our neighbors face around homelessness and addiction, which is a problem that's been escalating for, you know, decades, really. And so it's not new during COVID, but it certainly is the case that it's become more visible during COVID because of how many spaces have been closed down, how many people have fewer options and are spending more time outside. You know, in this sort of specific example on that front, I also sit on the public library board, the board of the Vancouver Public Library, and we're conscious of how many folks used libraries as a space during the day where they didn't have somewhere else to go, and used library washrooms as public washrooms where they didn't have other washrooms to access. And when libraries were closed during the early parts of the pandemic, those folks lost that space. And so we did see more people out in streets and parks, more people who had nowhere to use a washroom with dignity, and so we're having to use bushes and outdoor spaces, and I mean that's a horrible situation for anyone to be in, to not have a place where they can use a washroom. So I think it both it made more visible to a lot of our residents the poverty that exists in the city, the inequality that exists. It also made more visible the huge role that those public institutions like libraries, like our community centers and other public services play in this city. And it has amplified the need and the call for more truly affordable welfare rate housing, as well as stronger mental health supports. You know, I think even those of us who don't publicly wrestle with mental health diagnoses have had a harder time. I will say, you know, I have 2 kids at home. The level of stress in our home has increased over the pandemic. And we have otherwise all sorts of supports in place. So for folks in the city who don't have all of those supports, who were already struggling day to day, the added pressure of this pandemic has really pushed a lot of people further down in their mental health struggles. So the challenge for us as a local government is that the solutions in terms of housing and in terms of mental health supports are historically largely not in our jurisdiction. And I'm very cautious to not seem like I'm passing the buck. The city can and should play a role in these answers, but we also need the provincial and federal government to show up in a more serious way. So we've been hearing the provincial government has been more active at the table in talking about welfare rate housing and affordable housing. And we need the federal government, quite frankly, to show up to the table in a much more serious way on that front too. Historically, housing has been a federal mandate, and partly that's because people move around the country, of course. So folks who are homeless in Vancouver aren't all from Vancouver, though many of them, their last address, the last place they paid rent was in Vancouver, but it's a provincial issue, it's a federal issue, and so we need those levels of government as well. And this council has been yelling and screaming to try to get those partners to the table so that we can more adequately address these challenges, because we know the solutions, the solutions aren't magic. The solutions are known. They are housing, supportive housing, and a better range of mental health supports, as well as a safe supply of drugs, so people aren't forced to access an illegal and toxic drug supply, so that they can stay alive long enough to access the types of care and treatment that they need. All of these solutions are known, and we desperately need to be tackling them at a much faster rate. And so one of my roles on council is to advocate on all of those fronts, and another role is to keep acting in terms of what the city can do. This council recently put $30 million into immediate housing solutions, and we've been working on rolling those out as quickly as we can with the practical logistics of getting buildings in place, whatnot. But we wanted to say, this is how seriously we're taking this, and we need our senior government partners to step up as well. So all of that is actively underway, and also needs to be done 100 times more and 100 times faster, and that's what I sit with and wrestle with and lose sleep over every single day.
And I commend you and the team of the city council and the mayor for the focus and dedication, because it's a multi-pronged initiative, and it requires the province and the federal government as a team. The resources have to come, but the city does allocate resources. And so we were last week we were giving on the park on Venables, I forget the name of it, where the tenants
Strathcona Park.
Strathcona. So we were there, and then I was like, I think I read in the newspaper or on an online article, the city actually works to try and provide housing, like there is housing. So why would some people, like I know in a previous discussion I had with other members of city council years ago, they were saying that sometimes there are certain issues that people have pets, or they have certain mental health issues for whatever reason, or they have other companions that. What are the barriers between folks that choose to remain in tents to not avail of some of the housing the city is trying to provide? What are those barriers?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you'd expect, there are a whole range of them. So sometimes the barriers are the housing that we can make available doesn't feel to people like a better option, and so a portion of the shelter rate truly affordable housing in the city is single room occupancy hotels. Sometimes they're publicly run, or they're run by nonprofits. Sometimes they're privately run. The conditions of some of those hotels are pretty deplorable. The rooms don't lock, the washrooms are plugged and don't work. The other residents in the building may be wrestling with their own demons and be loud in their rooms with very thin walls. There are often bed bugs or other rodents. Some of these buildings are very inhumane. And I will say that a decade ago that I was working in the downtown east side, I visited many people in many SRO hotels, and it was not an acceptable living standard that some of these hotels operate in. So I think there are certainly folks living in tents in our parks who have lived in SROs and would rather live in a tent than go back to one of those rooms, particularly in the summer months in Vancouver. I'll add one of the other things I hear about the SRO rooms is just how cold they get in the winter because of draftiness and the lack of heat, and how stiflingly stuffy and hot they get in the summer. So also for folks with any kind of chronic health issues, they can be quite unhealthy places to be. So people may choose tents for that reason. Like you said, often people with pets who are a pretty key part of their support system may not be allowed into these buildings. Often a private room with a door isn't even available, and so the housing options that are available, unfortunately, are simply shelter beds in congregate settings. So a shelter bed in a large shelter. And again, even outside of the pandemic, for a lot of people with past trauma they're trying to heal, with mental health struggles, that's not a preferable or a safe option. And then the reality of the pandemic has meant that people have concerns about being in group settings like that because of COVID. And also the number of beds has been decreased because they've been spaced out over those shelters. So it is the case that there are a number of buildings that are SROs run by nonprofits or the city that are in good shape, but they're full because we don't have enough of those beds. There are people who choose shelters, and lately our shelter beds have been full too because we have fewer of them because of COVID restrictions. And so sometimes people have another choice and they're choosing to stay in a tent, and sometimes they don't have another choice because the choice is not viable for them, or it's just not there because there aren't enough units, there aren't enough beds. And so all of those are the struggle. We are have been looking at how we better uphold standards of maintenance to make sure that existing SRO rooms are up to a certain acceptable and healthy standard. And the city, it's been in the news over the last couple of years, the city expropriated a couple SRO buildings that were so dangerous and decrepit that they were not habitable anymore. And so now we're in the process of figuring out with the province how we repair or hopefully tear down and rebuild those buildings to replace those units, but in a much more supportive and livable way. And in the meantime, emergency shelter beds and temporary modular housing and all of that, all of these options continue to be on the table, and we're sort of scrambling for everything that we can do all at once. There's no one solution. And a friend of mine, Karen Ward, who's a drug advocate, drug policy expert in the downtown east side, often highlights how important it is for people to feel that they have a choice, not just to say, rather than where you are, here's the one other place you can go. But it's important for all of us, and so it's important for our neighbors who are homeless too, to feel like they have some agency in their own healing, in their own housing. And so options matter for people, so that they take them up, and they feel like they can take care of themselves and have a say in their future.
And earlier in the discussion, we talked about discrimination and racism, and I would say the homeless community is a vulnerable community that does sometimes when I do talk about the downtown east side, people that have never been there and don't understand the stories of the people, there's a lack of sympathy. And then the one story that I know that really touched me was, a father, his son had passed away, and he went into a deep depression, alcoholism, and drugs, and then he wound up on the downtown east side. So I'm a father as well. So when somebody has that kind of traumatic loss, and human beings are human beings, he's self-medicating, whatever it was, he didn't intend to wind up on the downtown east side. So just For our listeners and people in general, human beings, right? People are human beings. Everyone's a son, a daughter, and they come from somewhere. There's a story, there's something that happened. So whether it's a physical disability, whether it's a mental health issue, a traumatic event in their life, maybe a sexual assault, something has happened that has created this sort of situation where people will resort to drugs or alcohol or these situations because for whatever reason they're not able to cope with the day to day because of certain stressors. And so the human aspect, let's talk about some human stories, obviously confidentiality in mind, but I'm sure you've come across certain situations. You understand anecdotally the human component of people there that are struggling so people can understand they're human beings.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of trauma that people are wrestling with and trying to heal is immense. The other aspect I would add is the layers of intergenerational trauma in the downtown east side from residential schools, and before that from the impacts of colonization in Canada, all are part of why we see larger numbers of Indigenous folks living in the downtown east side, as well as ongoing impacts of racism against Indigenous communities. Yeah, I think it's so important, and actually just listening to you speak to that makes me think back to our conversation 20 minutes ago about the value in interfaith work of bringing people together across bridges to hear one another's stories. And it is the reality in Vancouver that we have huge amounts of wealth and we have huge amounts of poverty, and I think you're right that for a lot of residents across the city, they haven't had a chance to move in up close and hear those human stories of people's lives as they wrestle with homelessness or with addiction or with layers of trauma and a need for healing. And hearing those stories, I think, bring people together with more empathy and more willingness to bring about solutions. There has been, I've been troubled in the last number of months by a kind of rise in some publicly expressed sentiment that is sort of anti-homeless people, anti-drug user, like a pretty, I'm wrestling, as you can tell, with how to say this, but a real lack of compassion in how people see those who are so visibly struggling in our neighborhoods. And we have work to do on that front, because that stigma makes the situation worse for everyone, and it certainly makes it harder to bring about the solutions that we need, including, we can't just build affordable housing, more affordable housing in the downtown east side. This is a citywide problem, and I have spoken a lot about the need to build supportive shelter rate housing in neighborhoods all across the city, because my experience working in the downtown east side, the stories I hear are that there are many people for whom that's their home neighborhood and they would like to find housing there. And there are many other people who would like to move out of the neighborhood, who would find it easier to get back on their feet with some space and distance away from some of the triggers that they might experience in that neighborhood. And so we need both of those options available for people, and that means building more supportive housing in other neighborhoods of the city and increasing stigma about mental health or drug use or homelessness makes it harder to build that housing in each of our neighborhoods. And so all of these things connect to one another. And again, I think, as you've said, that the need to see one another, to humanize those stories and those struggles matters a lot. And again, that's something we can play a role in as elected officials. And it's equally powerful to see it happening from community leaders like yourself, who reach far beyond my reach and can help break down that stigma and those barriers.
And yeah, even as you said, discrimination and prejudice to homeless people that are homeless. So people, when they hear homeless, they don't look at people and individuals. They just think, oh, they choose to be like that. And then so this is a big learning I had. Some people think when somebody's addicted to drugs and alcohol, it's their choice. And I was like, once somebody's addicted, it is a mental health issue. It's not like you have a choice when you're addicted. And so I've had these debates with certain people that, again, have a certain bias because they don't know the ramifications. Again, nobody intends to become an addict, or nobody intends to become homeless, but addicts become discriminated against, and homeless becomes discriminated against because people don't know the context of what happened, that individual story, and there's a lack of sympathy because people don't know those stories. And when the city does provide these things for the safety of the people, which is safe injection sites, needle exchange, all these sorts of things, there's a tendency from people to think, oh, why is the city doing that? They're exacerbating the problem, but they're trying to provide the safety of the people, because if it's not done, and this was I was at it was an interfaith leaders group to talk about homelessness. So there was a lot of statistics that if the city doesn't help that one individual, the cost to society, the actual dollar cost to the society, is much more than if the city didn't invest in trying to help the people. So left unchecked, left to go as is without providing those helps, just the economic impact is manifold by not actually helping, whereas the city's actually saving the society from much bigger costs by addressing these issues. So I know we've unpacked a number of kind of things here, but please do, like, just from that addiction standpoint, the stigma of addiction, and then the economic cost.
Yeah, the studies that have been done on the economic impact, I think, are fascinating, and I appreciate how those, each of us are swayed a bit differently by different arguments, and so for those for whom that is a compelling case, I'm glad to have those numbers. And as you say, it is very clearly the case that it would be more fiscally responsible. It would cost less for us to house people and provide the health supports that they require than our current patchwork system, which relies very heavily on policing, on emergency room use, and a kind of rather than preventative healthcare and supports, an emergency healthcare response. The way that we are responding to these crises makes no sense if the goal is fiscal responsibility. We really should be supporting people more proactively in all of the ways that they need. And I will say, well, as I said, I find that compelling as a person of faith. The moral argument for me is what pulls at me, which is that, of course, each of our neighbors, each other human, deserves the chance to live and stay alive for as long as they need to find healing and wellness and get back on their feet, as they say. So that's the pull for me to harm reduction, to supporting overdose prevention sites, as well to advocating for safe supply and a decriminalization of drugs. We see that the systems we have set up right now are failing people, both in terms of the over-criminalization that leads people into this spiral of the justice system and further addiction and struggle. It's also failing people because the drug supply right now is so toxic that people are dying just trying to self-medicate, just trying to meet this habit where they don't need to die if there were clean drugs available. And if we weren't so set on, in a kind of moral way, punishing the use of certain drugs, then they could access what is for many people, as you said, a form of self-medication for trauma. They could access a clean enough drug that they weren't at risk of dying, and keep doing so until they found other supports as well to patchwork their own healing, and for us to provide a better system of support. You know, there are lots of drugs in our culture that we have legalized and condone, and I have no doubt that if there were a poisoned, you know, batch of beer out there, that there would be a strong response by government, by health authorities. But we have, as part of a kind of othering and distance, decided that some drugs are morally bad, and we haven't responded adequately because of that to care for the folks who are literally dying in the thousands because of that. So, I mean, that's all of these avenues into support for housing and safe supply matter, and I am hopeful that more and more people get to that place of support. And for me, that's the piece that is most compelling, is just the dignity and worth of every human being, and that includes human beings who use drugs. That includes humans who have have more visible demons and mental health issues. Each of those lives is important, and I think we should be doing all we can to make sure that they stay alive and receive the supports that they need to live a kind of whole and healthy life.
And agreed. And
that's my preaching. Sorry, that's sort of not my less my politician hat and more my minister hat. I couldn't suppress it.
I think we have our respective kind of heartfelt desire to help our community, and I'll share with you one story. One of our community, again, he was addicted to opioids, and he was on the downtown east side shooting up. On the surface, if anyone would have seen him, in, you know, objectively, people that don't have the experience that you have, or to a lesser degree myself, like people would have no sympathy per se. But I will say, he's now come out of it. He's been able through, and I think it's a holistic, multidisciplinary, where it's the government supports, the city supports, the community supports, even the faith-based supports. Because a human being is many things. It's not just food. It's not just counseling. It requires the whole society, from the government to the private sector to faith-based communities, and all the resources to help everybody. So this individual, again, deep in addiction, family problems, lost his job, lost his home, and then, you know, through the 12-step program, AA, NA, and community help. And now he's an advocate going out. So he basically, he was somebody on the downtown east side. Maybe people could drive by and have some sort of, you know, whatever prejudicial thought about this person. But I have so much respect for him, because not only is he recovered, but he's now going to find others that are in addiction, to help them join the 12-step program, and just a lot of respect that although he fell down, but he's now, through the collective work of what he's doing, the community support, getting back on his feet and contributing to society. And I would say a lot of the people downtown, you know, some are very educated, some have multiple talents and abilities that people are unaware of. It's just like prejudice and racial discrimination sees a color in a religion and makes a judgment, and the term homeless or addict evokes another judgment that people have. But again, human beings are human beings. Until you get to know, understand the people, meet the people, that's what's going to create a level of desire within all of us to say, hey, you know what, we have to help everybody from every facet of society. And that's my soapbox, like, because I've seen it work on that one individual, how all these supports came, and now he, in my view, is someone I hold in great respect for what he's been able to accomplish from where he went. And I think there's many people like that, but if we don't help, or if we just ignore it, or we criticize, it's not going to solve anything. And really, the power of human beings is powerful. With the right holistic support, some of the people can be even much better contributors to society than we are. And
yeah,
so that's what,
I mean, I will here's allow me to be just a tiny bit theological also, which is like, it gets to, I have such a deep belief in the possible redemption of everyone, like that every single person has within them an incredible amount of worth and wisdom that that we can and should find a way to lift up and support, not just that some people might be able to recover, but that were we to create the kinds of systems that that are possible and that people deserve, that every single person has that in them. And as you highlight so well in your example, that all of us have an incredible amount to learn from people who use drugs, from people who are homeless or have been homeless, and all of those voices should be a more central part of, for policymakers and decision makers like me, should be at the table and should be informing the types of decisions that we make, because they know what will work and they know what that struggle looks like in the deep depths of it, and those lived experiences should be informing how we respond. And I think governments have been doing a better job of seeking out those voices, and healthcare systems as well, but there's still a ways to go, because the kind of gap between who's in leadership positions and who knows on the ground these struggles most acutely, it is still a gap. And so the story you lift up is so important in the role that folks with these lived experiences play in helping the rest of us both better understand the specifics of the situation and kind of find more of our own humanity in the story and humanity of someone that we might have written off. So just really grateful for that story, and every time I get to hear stories like that.
And even this forum, in our discussion with you being able to express your work that you've been doing prior to being in office, I think even in our community, to hear from you, because you are a policymaker, you are a decision maker, you are in government, and so this type of a forum to understand what the city is doing, and what individuals like yourself in the leadership role have this mission as well, to help the greater good. So with our audience in the Muslim community, for this dialogue to be able to at least let our community know the city's working with us about Islamophobia and these items, but also these other greater societal issues. And I'm sure there's many other topics we could discuss, but limiting it to kind of where we're talking about racism, discrimination as it applies to, again, faith or religion or race, but also as it applies to vulnerable people that have mental health, addiction, and homeless, which are discriminated against. And we are collective brothers and sisters in humanity, different faiths, different beliefs, but again, we have this desire to help our community. If we help our community, we help our families. That it's just, we protect others, and we respect we protect our families, and we protect ourselves. So it really almost is a way of our own internal kind of sense that I am contributing to society, but by helping others is actually even helping myself. So it's almost self-serving to a degree. But just to wrap up our discussion, I want to thank you again and the city for the proclamation to join us at this coming event on January 29th, just to remember members of our community that were in Quebec City that were killed because they they were Muslims, and they were praying, right? So again, prayer in all our faith, praying to God for the various reasons we pray. And in this memorial is just to, again, showcase leaders like yourself. We have the Defense Minister, Harjit Sajjan, who's going to speak, the Minister of Inclusivity and Diversity, Bardish Chugger, the VPD hate crimes, RCMP hate crimes, the Parliamentary Secretary, Rasha Singh, on anti-racism. So we have multiple speakers, Haroon and Mufti Asim and Bilal Jima, a lot of our community members. And again, this collective work, Islam Unraveled, the Muslim Care Center, there's so many people in our team that do much more than I do. I'm just grateful to be part of the team, and grateful that I'm at least a voice to communicate with government, with yourself, to share our respective stories and our respective work together, and looking forward to continuing our work beyond what's already happened, and hopefully tomorrow and the day after, our societies and our cities get better and better with the collective work we're doing. And please do, in closing, any final comments for the Muslim community, for the listeners, from the city and yourself.
Just a huge and heartfelt thank you for the work that you do, for the work that the Muslim Care Center do, for all the volunteers. I know all of this doesn't happen without kind of layers and layers of volunteers and mutual aid and support. It's really stood out to me during this pandemic. I think a lesson we've all learned about how interconnected our lives are, how interdependent we are. And so I am just full of gratitude for everything that you do, and the spaces that you create and the bridges that you built that help us all become more human and see more of our own humanity. So I'm glad for this conversation. I look forward to the day when we can sit in a room together, and I would welcome the opportunity to hear from more folks in the congregation and in your many networks, to get to just listen and hear stories and get to better know people. Seems like a dream to me, and I look forward to when we're allowed to do that again. And in the meantime, grateful for this online conversation.
Yeah, very thankful as well on our end, and would love to invite you and other members of City Council to come to the Muslim Care Center. I know Councillor Jean Swanson had come to visit us, I think, last year, and with some of our team like Sharina Khan and others that do a lot of great work. We'd love to introduce you to the rest of the team when the pandemic hopefully whenever the restrictions are lifted, and we'd be a great honor for you and other members who would like to come to join us and meet the rest of our team.
I will happily work with you to set that up and invite the rest of council too.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Islam Unraveled podcast. To learn more about our programs, please visit us on Facebook or at www.islamunraveled.ca. We'll see you next time.